Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. Healthcare is the single largest sector of the American economy. Yet according to some experts, inefficiency and error plague the system. What's wrong? And what new options will soon be available to radically change the way healthcare is delivered? To find out, Policy Watch is joined by Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and the author of Saving Lives and Saving Money, Transforming Health and Healthcare. Now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Newt Gingrich, on behalf of the University of Maryland and the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs, welcome to Policy Watch.
Good to be here.
You have said that when you left the speakership, that you decided to be a thought leader. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that before you have policies, you have to have thinking. And that there's a niche in America for people who understand the requirements of politics and government, but who also pay attention to the general pattern of ideas and who try to find solutions that fit intellectually, that are both right for the country and right for their particular philosophy. And so I spend about 40% of my time on national security and about 40% of my time on health, and then 20% of the time basically earning a living.
Why health and healthcare? Why did you choose that as one of your two major areas of concern?
Well, like national security, it's life and death. Health is literally life and death, and in terms of a biological attack, the two overlap 100%. Second, it is the largest single sector of the economy, and one which I think is remarkably out of sync with the modern world and remarkably available for a transformation that could be truly historic and that would both save lives and save money.
Now, you just used the word transformation, and I know that's a very important word for you. Why do you use that word?
Because I think people keep trying to find solutions inside the system they inherited. And I think, in fact, you have to move to a new system, to a new way of thinking, to a new approach. Imagine that we had tried to solve the problem of transportation in the 1890s by focusing on the stagecoach and creating a better, more efficient stagecoach, rather than by inventing the car, the truck, the airplane, and so forth. I mean, that's an example of the scale of transformation. Or imagine in the 1920s that we had tried to work at getting a better kind of vaudeville, rather than inventing movies, radio, television, all the things we've invented since then.
Now, you've written a marvelous book, Saving Lives
and Saving Money.
Before we ask whether we can do both of those, in the book you lay out what you see as some of the major problems with the health system that we have today. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about them. And I think some of the more striking ones that people don't talk about are the degree of danger that you see and harm in the current health system.
I mean, I think you have to give a lot of credit to the Institute of Medicine, which has issued a series of very bold reports where they have indicated, it's sort of our leading institute in the whole country in terms of prestige and respect. They've gone out and looked, and they make the following points. First, there are between 44,000 and 98,000 Americans a year who die of medical error in hospitals. This is medical error. Okay. That, by the way, would be in the aviation business an amazing number of New York to Washington shuttles or of Boeing 747s crashing every year.
This helps to explain the size of the trial lawyers' lobby as well, no?
It does, and although I think they actually compound each other because the threat of lawsuits makes it harder to get accurate information about errors, because people know if they tell you the truth about errors, they increase the likelihood of being sued.
Part of the problem with modern medicine, as you've talked about, is that in the practice of medicine, the new technologies that we have all around us aren't used. You talk, for example, about writing prescriptions.
Right. It's one of my favorite examples I share with most audiences is that my granddaughter visited us last August when she was 3.5, and we took her to a toy store, and we bought her my first purse, which is plastic. and it had a plastic comb and plastic lipstick, and it had a keychain for plastic keys, and including a clicker so she could unlock her car electronically. It had a plastic cell phone, and it had a change purse that had inside it a debit card. And she found the debit card, and she looked at it for a little while, and she came over after about 5 minutes, and she said, "This white space, this is for my name. This is my card." Now, here's a 3.5-year-old who understands cell phones, electronic clickers to open the car door, and debit cards. In June, the state of Florida adopted a bill requiring doctors to print legibly when they write prescriptions. Now, I object to that bill on 2 grounds. The first is it is a fantasy to think you're going to teach doctors to print legibly. And the second is you live in an age when the right answer is electronic prescribing. And interestingly, SureScripts is a firm which has launched in Rhode Island in July of this year a statewide electronic prescribing program. Tufts University just bought 5,000 electronic prescribing devices, handheld devices, for every doctor in the Tufts medical system. So you're seeing the beginning of a different world, and that would be a good example of transformation. Reform would be trying to get doctors to print legibly. Transformation would be getting them to actually use a handheld device to electronically order your next prescription.
Transformation indeed. In fact, if you could add on to that, and I know you actually do, something so that I don't have to carry the prescription to my pharmacy and wait for 45 minutes while they fill it. Now I'd really be...
Well, it serves several purposes. First of all, 40% of all prescriptions today require a callback.
Is that right?
4 out of every 10 prescriptions require a callback. Either the pharmacist can't read it, the patient is already taking something which is counterindicated for the new prescription. There is a less expensive drug available, but they need the doctor's permission to order it. But for one reason or another, in 40% of the occasions with a paper prescription, the pharmacist will call back, talk to either the nurse or the doctor. So you have this cycle of wasted time that's really quite expensive. Second, as you point out, because it's currently a hand-carried prescription, you then go queue up in line, wait to turn it in, wait to get it back out. Now, by contrast with an electronic prescription, the doctor could have on their page what you're already taking, so they could know not to prescribe something because it's the wrong thing given whatever else you're taking. The doctor could have on that page the entire list of available drugs for that problem, so they could order the least expensive that was medically appropriate. The doctor could also send the signal electronically so that by the time you got to the drugstore, it was already prepared and waiting for you just to walk through, pick it up, and leave. That's a very different world than the world we've been in. And by the way, both a more accurate world and a less expensive world.
And if we could get UPS to do next day delivery for $3.50, which you can do in this town, we might complete the circle.
That's right.
I might never have to go to the pharmacy.
That's exactly right.
I was talking to a doctor friend of mine, and I said, "Why don't you do this?" I just read your book. And she said, "Oh, we're all set to do it, but there were a few older physicians in our partnership. We have to wait until they leave before we do it." Is that what we're waiting on here?
Well, I think in the new Medicare bill, we incentivize moving towards an electronic prescription. And I think that what your doctor friend told you is part of what's wrong with the system, that we move at the pace of the least willing doctor rather than moving at the pace of the best for patient new information.
You mentioned the new Medicare bill, and I want to talk about that in a minute, but the incentives caught up within insurance practices in general surely are part of this. I was asking that same physician friend, why can't I do more of this by phone? I rarely go to meetings these days. And even, why can't I do some of this by email? And what I was told was very interesting. I was told, well, there's no reimbursable category for answering email.
That's exactly right.
The modern world, though, works on email.
And you find some places beginning to change that. If you look at, and there are a couple of ways to change it, but if there's a small firm in Las Vegas called worlddoc.com. And they have a relationship with a number of companies, and they provide information for the employees. And they reduce, on average, the number of visits to doctors' offices by 63%. Now, the problem with the way we have been doing medical business is if a doctor kept you really, really healthy, they'd go broke because you wouldn't come by and have anything to charge for. In fact, there was an article in one of the papers, I think in the New York Times in the last 3 days, about Intermountain Health, which is in Utah and Idaho. Terrific hospital chain, very modern, very progressive, very quality oriented. Every time they stop a patient from getting pneumonia, they cost themselves money. Because if the patient got pneumonia, they'd be admitted to the hospital, they get 3 or 4 days of billings. So they actually last year, by having better outcomes, lost several $1 million. Because the system's exactly backwards right now. And one of the challenges I think that the Bush administration has to take up in January is, how do we redesign the incentives so that we're actually rewarding a doctor or a hospital for keeping you healthy so that you don't have to go to the emergency room or you don't have to go to the hospital?
How do we do that?
Well, we have some baby steps in the Medicare bill. We have provisions for health management for the first time for people with diabetes, for example. Diabetes is the largest single cost driver of Medicare. Every seventh dollar in Medicare comes from diabetes. It gives you heart disease, kidney disease. It gives you blindness. The leading cause of adult blindness is diabetes, and it can lead to amputation of feet and legs. So it's a much more terrible disease than people realize. If you manage your diabetes well, you are dramatically less likely to get sick. But historically, up until this new Medicare bill, we didn't do anything for you in Medicare if you had diabetes. But once your kidneys failed, we put you on dialysis as long as you could live. So I had an uncle who lived 7 years on dialysis, which was very, very expensive. But in the preceding period, we didn't pay for the doctor to educate my uncle to do the right things, to use the right techniques, to not have to get on dialysis. So I think you've got to start with a really profound change in that sense. We also, for the very first time, begin to incentivize coordinating care for a person who's really, really sick. People don't realize it, but 5% of the people on Medicare spend 50% of the money because they're the sickest people. In effect, they spend 19 times as much per person as the other 95%.
Wow.
But today, even though on average that group has between 5 and 7 problems, we don't coordinate the care. So they could be going to 3, 4, 5 doctors, getting 3 or 4 or 5 different sets of prescriptions. At one point, my mother had 3 doctors and 17 prescriptions, and none of them were looking at what the other one was prescribing. What we do for the very first time in the new Medicare bill is we begin to coordinate, have an incentive to coordinate the care so that somebody will actually know all the different drugs you're taking, all the different problems you have, how they interact with each other. And that's a significant first step in the right direction. There's a firm called Health Hero Network. They've created a little plastic device about this size called a Health Buddy. And the Health Buddy sits next to your coffee pot in the morning. And it has a screen that lights up. And it's for people who don't do computing very much. And it will ask you questions. If you're diabetic, it'll say, did you check your blood sugar today? What was your blood sugar? And it'll go through, what's your weight? It goes through a series of things. Every evening through EDS, it sends the information to the doctor's office. And an expert... EDS takes the information from your desk, from your countertop of your kitchen, takes it right to the doctor's office, and it shows up color-coded. If you're doing fine, it's green. If you have a few problems, it's yellow. If you have a big problem, it's red. So in the morning, the nurse can come in, look at all the people, let's say, who are diabetic or who have heart disease or who have asthma, and instantly see these 3 need my attention right this minute and get on the telephone. Now, in a Veterans Administration project in Florida, the Health Buddy reduced the number of emergency room visits by 42%, reduced the number of hospitalizations by 62%, and reduced the number of days in the hospital by 82%. Now, that's a remarkable savings for a device that costs very little.
How do you incentivize, how do you encourage practitioners to go to that model? How does the bill do it? How would you do it?
Partially you do it because you start paying doctors to keep people well. You say, if you're dealing with a doctor who has 1,000 diabetics, you say, if you can keep the number of emergency room visits below a certain number, and you can keep the number of hospitalizations below a certain number, and if at the end of the year 96% of your patients are in compliance, that is, have done the right things, done the right way, we'll give you a bonus. General Electric is now doing that. General Electric is actually contracting with doctors that they have a program called Bridges to Excellence that 5 or 6 big firms have joined in on. And they're contracting with doctors to take on a population that has known problems. And they then pay the doctors an incentive to actually keep these people healthy enough that they don't go to the hospital.
Now that's
a totally different model.
But that implies a health maintenance organization.
No, it just implies a coordinated information system. You could go to an individual doctor if you had good computerized information, and it wouldn't matter.
But then you'd have to contract with that individual doctor.
You do contract with an individual doctor as part of that.
How far will the new drug bill take us on these kinds of questions? What things are in that bill to transform medicine?
Well, I think first of all, the Medicare bill on just the technical side of being a healthier country, having a better system, has very significant steps in the right direction. For example, we have an incentive. Hospitals will be paid more if they use information technology and supply 35 quality pieces of data every year about the hospital. So for the very first time, you'll be able to go online and look up the hospitals, the 5 or 10 hospitals nearest you, and you'll see which ones have the longest stay, which ones have the highest death rate. There's a study done, there's a firm called HealthShare, which has taken the Medicare data and put it through an expert system. And in Arizona, for example, they have proven that in Phoenix, Arizona, the difference between the best hospital for heart care and the worst hospital for heart care is 500%.
Wow.
You are 5 times as likely to die in the worst hospital, which is, by the way, more expensive than the best hospital. Consistently, when you do these kind of studies, the best hospitals are less expensive because they have fewer medical errors and they have fewer hospital-induced illnesses. And the result is people are less likely to stay for a long period of time because they don't catch the second disease, they don't have to recover from a medical mistake. So it's not the way people normally think. Quality is actually less expensive in health, and lack of quality is actually more expensive in health.
Let me move our conversation a little bit to the other side of what's been happening in healthcare, which is the transformation because of high tech, biotech, physics, in fact, right? And all the changes that are taking place, partly as a result of the research at the National Institute of Health. I think many people would, before we talk about the substance, I think many people don't know that you, when you were a speaker, had a great deal to do with expanding the spending at NIH and helping bring it into the 21st century. How did that happen?
Well, I give a lot of credit to John Porter, who was a congressman from Illinois, who was the chairman of the Health and Human Services Subcommittee of Appropriations, and to Connie Mack, who was a senator from Florida, whose family had a long history of cancer throughout the family. And both of them came to us very early when we had just become a majority in 1995, and we were deeply committed to balancing the federal budget. And they said one of the places that we should not only not cut, but we should commit to double is the National Institutes of Health. And John Porter in particular brought in about 40 research vice presidents from major companies, pharmaceuticals, biotech companies, other companies that deal in this area. And all of these vice presidents said, look, we're conservatives, we believe in the free market, but we're here to tell you that the National Institutes of Health are the basic research on which everything we're doing is built. And so we took the commitment to double the National Institutes of Health. The only mistake we made in retrospect is we should have also doubled the National Science Foundation at the same time, because as you were pointing out, if you look at brain studies, it's actually physics and mathematics which have made it possible to have a revolution in our knowledge of the human brain, not biology. Biology is the after effect of the physics and the mathematics, creating a whole new generation of instrumentation so you can have functional MRIs while people are alive. You can see the brain actually functioning
right.
While you're still there. That's such an enormous change in how we think about the human mind that the National Science Foundation should have been increased, and in fact, the Congress over the next 5 years should catch up with the National Science Foundation to make it proportionally equal to the NIH the way it was back before we started. And I really believe passionately in the power of scientific research. I think that it has been the great engine of the last 350 years. I think it'll continue to be a great engine. I think we'll have 4 times the rate of change in the next 25 years that we had in the last 25, which means that between now and 2028, we'll see as much change as between 1903 and 2003. I think that's literally true, not hyperbole. So I think that any country that is not deeply committed on science and math is a country that's rapidly going to become obsolescent.
And we are indeed, aren't we, on the cusp of many treatments. You use a wonderful, I think, metaphor for it in your book, and that is we will have the equivalent of antibodies for cancer. I think we already have one.
That's right. Yeah, I think I'll be very surprised if within 10 years you can't drink 3 million single cell or smaller devices with your orange juice in the morning, whose own, in fact, they would be much smaller than a single cell. They'd be down at the nanoscale level, several atoms that would have propensity to eat cancer. And it would go through your body every day. And if it found cancer, it would eat it. And if it didn't find cancer, it would leave your body. And then next morning, you drink another orange juice. And I'll be very surprised if that isn't the norm within a decade.
I'm sure that our audience will just not believe this. They'll say, what is this? These people have been inhaling something. But indeed, there are these new therapies being tried right today.
Oh, if you haven't taken some time to look at nanoscale science and technology and quantum mechanics, you really can't understand what's about to happen. These are the great breakthroughs of the next 20 years, much like physics was in the 20th century. I mean, nanoscale, basically, for those in the audience who aren't deeply into this, nano means 1 billionth. So a nanosecond is a billionth of a second. A nanometer is a billionth of a meter. Tiny is a reasonable way to say it. And basically, the nanoscale world is 400 atoms and below. And at 200 atoms, you enter the world of quantum mechanics, where the rules change radically. We don't actually understand it very well, but we know how to measure it, we know how to use it. These things are going to lead to changes that are phenomenal. I just talked with a chief of research at the Department of Energy who said that they had just developed glasses for people who had gone blind because of physical decay of the eye. These glasses don't work if your brain is, if you had a stroke. But if your mind is okay, but your eyes have for some reason gone bad, they have a brand new set of glasses that currently have 16 pixels. Now we have digital cameras that have 3.2 million pixels, to give you a sense of scale here. But with as few as 16 pixels on your glass, you can communicate a signal to the retina of the blind eyes, which allows you to see a room well enough to walk around and not hit the chairs or not hit the people. Because your mind works as a massive supercomputer and processes that data. They're currently upgrading the glasses to 60 pixels. And they think they'll have that sometime early next year. And my guess is within 2 more years, you'll actually have a set of glasses that allow people who are technically legally blind to see well enough to get around their home. Won't be good enough to drive, won't be good enough to go watch a movie with any fine detail, but will really dramatically change their ability to live a decent life.
At institutions like the NIH, there is a process of determining what diseases get studied and what diseases don't get studied. And you're lucky if, it's the wrong way to put it, of course, but you're lucky to have a Michael J. Fox if you're interested in Parkinson's and so forth, Christopher Reeves for other things, and of course the HIV/AIDS lobbyists have been tremendously positive. I think it's not an accident that there are some major facilities on the NIH campus named after relatively senior senators. Are you happy with the way those decisions are made about the allocation of funds within NIH?
Well, I actually think the bias has been historically against things like diabetes. I mean, diabetes affects more people than any other single illness. And yet historically it is dramatically underfunded because it doesn't quite fit what they're doing. The research gets scattered. It doesn't get focused on. I think it was actually wrong for political imposition of specific things at NIH in the sense that you'd really like to have scientists driving the resources towards the research. On the other hand, I think that it's also wrong for the NIH bureaucracy to become too bureaucratic. I mean, we just doubled the amount of money they have. They now have about $29 billion a year. And it's reasonable to expect some level of accountability for that scale of money and to have a very open, transparent system, I think, of what they're funding. I would also say some small amount of money should be available for the crazy ideas that will never get through the bureaucracy of allocation. Over time, peer review tends to be a very conservatizing system. And ideas that are outside, I'll give you an example. Plate tectonics was first proposed by Wegener as a way of describing what happens to the continents in geology in 1915. It was ridiculed, driven out of geology, actually believed in paleontology, but driven out of geology, and wasn't accepted as factually correct until 1963. Now, in that entire interim period, the weight of establishment evidence would have blocked anybody from applying to study plate tectonics through a normal peer review system because it was too aberrant, it was too outside. And I do think some money should be spent on wildcatting, on that interesting idea that doesn't fit any of the traditional bureaucracies and doesn't quite fit the social standing of the university, but that just might have the glimmering of a great breakthrough.
Well, on that note, on behalf of the University of Maryland School of Public Affairs, Newt Gingrich, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join us in a future episode for part 2 of our interview with Newt Gingrich. This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding for Policy Watch with Doug Becheroff is provided by the Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation.
We are PBS.